Seconded by Beth Folger.
We have a motion and a second. I would ask for all those in support of the agenda as proposed to please indicate with aye.
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 Any opposed with nay? All right, we have approval of our agenda. I want to take just a minute to set the stage for our process this morning. I want to thank those that had the opportunity to provide thoughtful feedback, either in emails to Crystal and myself or through the Google Doc. What we have done since our 2 small group meetings is obviously make some consistency edits in the document. I've also had the opportunity to meet with Tom Tomberlin, with Human Resources and Licensure, with Department of Public Instruction, and I want to share some feedback from that session. And I also invited Tom to join us this morning, and he is on the phone and available as a resource should we need it as we go down the stretch with the recommendations. Initially, our thought had been to have an executive summary and then a set of recommendations following that executive summary, which is the document that we've been dealing with for the last few months, the recommendations by committee. As we got closer to today's meeting, our thinking was that perhaps we have just one document that has a purpose and a reminder of the charge, and some overarching clarity around our definition of literacy and the science of reading, and then move immediately into our recommendations. So the document that was sent to you last evening reflects just that, that we have one document that has a reminder of our purpose, the specific charge that we had, and then moves into our recommendations organized by the categories of professional development, curriculum and instructional resources, and pre-service preparation and licensure. Our goal today is to have a review, final review of those recommendations with any edits and suggestions, and we have several that are in front of us. And so our goal will be to go through each recommendation one by one, while looking at the document holistically to make any suggestions that tighten and make it as crisp as possible. I do want to share one change that I made that reflects the conversation with Tom Tomberlin, so I want to acknowledge that before we get going so that there's particular attention paid to that, and that falls in the professional development recommendation number 4. In our most recent draft that the group had reviewed, we had 20 contact hours of literacy professional development. After talking with Tom, 30 hours of literacy professional development is already required for licensure renewal. And so the thinking was that we certainly don't want 20 hours of professional development aligned to the current science of reading and then 10 hours of an individual's choice for consistency. I certainly want to acknowledge that that was a change I made based on that conversation. So that's why I'm highlighting it before we begin, and certainly want to invite discussion as we move through the document. Thus far, any edits that have been made to the document have been for consistency, not for significant shifts in content, except for that one change from 20 contact hours to 30. So I wanted to make the group aware of that before we started. Again, the thinking was that if it's already a requirement for 30, why would we recommend 20, given our strong desire to advance the ball for consistency across our state. The other thing that has been addressed, and again, welcome your feedback, was questions that particularly came up in the session last week regarding our charge. You will notice in the executive summary, we have noted that charge, and we were asked to specifically focus on grades K-3 with an understand that there might be expansion beyond K3. And so as we go through the document now reflects K3 with a few exceptions when there was a recommendation for grades 4 or 5. So I just wanted to provide that clarity that we were specifically asked to address K3, not pre-K through 12. And so in response to our charge, that consistency currently is reflected in the document, but if there's strong sentiment as we move through that there's a need to adjust or clarify for particular grade levels, certainly that is the purpose of today. We also had the opportunity to hear from Kristen. I want to thank her for her thoughtful review for coherence and voice. And so those of you may want to pull up, if you have a second device, some of her suggested edits. We will be using for our purposes today the posted draft document as we go through, but certainly want folks to be in a position to respond to that. There also has been a suggestion that we think about the order of the presentation of our recommendations. So as we move through the document, please keep that idea in mind in terms of coherence and logical sequencing. If you feel there's an order for our recommendations in terms of curriculum and resources, professional development, and pre-service and preparation, those are the type of inputs we're looking for this morning, because this is an important document for the children in our state at the end of the day, and we want to make sure the document is as clear as possible. So with that, we now have the latest draft, and this, I want to emphasize, is still a draft until we move to a vote later in our meeting today. So that's just an overview and lifting up of certain adjustments that have been made and sort of our purpose today. So as we move to the purpose page, I want to just acknowledge that really this is not a place for edits, because quite frankly, we have taken language as it was read and is a part of the State Board of Education agenda. This was actually read out loud at that meeting, but it's obviously placed in here for the purpose of setting the stage for the why of our work. So I don't want to appear to be rushing through this piece, but this is language lifted directly from the charge. So the other thing that you will notice here that I will acknowledge is Deanna was kind enough to go back and look at the record from the board agenda. And so you will see that the reference is to a literacy task force and not what used to be a pre-K-12 literacy task force, because as the official charge to the group, it was that it was a literacy task force. So we will move on beyond the charge, but just wanted to explain where that language came from. And now we're to the literacy task force recommendations. I certainly want to thank Deanna and Barbara Forum and Laurie Lee for their support in helping us, having attended all of our meetings, either face-to-face or virtually, to try to capture and provide the context for our work. So I invite feedback for this particular section. I think it reflects much of our early conversations, but certainly want to allow for any input that folks may have.
And I have provided a number of small revisions to this section, and I could go through them. This is Kristen, or?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
This would be the time to do that.
Okay. While I just adjust my technology here so I can see both. In the first paragraph under literacy task force recommendations, the second sentence reads, learning to read is a continuum of knowledge and, It probably says skills and strategies. I can't read everything on the screen, but I'd like to change that to just simply say a developmental process. Again, this is represented in the document I sent earlier today.
So the proposed change, I'm just making sure I'm capturing that, would be learning to read is a developmental process.
And then continues from there as written, beginning at birth with oral language development.
Is there any feedback on that suggested language from anybody in terms of a concern?
I think that makes sense.
I agree as well.
It makes it sound like it's a biological process that unfolds naturally, which we know not to be the case.
Yeah, I think you have development in there too much because it's already implied beginning at birth with oral language development and progressing to the development of written language. So putting in the continuum of knowledge and skills puts those knowledge and skills into a developmental framework anyway in the rest of the sentence. That this came from one of our task force meetings in, I want to say February or March. This continuum of knowledge and skills.
I was just looking to create parallelism throughout the document. I don't really want to argue this point vociferously. It was really a minor edit from my perspective. I disagree with the maturation perspective that I think Sandra raised.
Any other feedback in terms of an interest in adjusting language or remaining as written? Okay. I will also be counting on Deanna to monitor the chat if that's a place folks would want to provide any feedback as well, so that we can review that as we go through. The next paragraph, Kristen, did you want to review suggested changes there?
Rather in the first sentence, rather than the word regarding, I just wanted it to be more active, say that that it addresses these things, that reading instruction really needs to address the acquisition of language, etc. I added the word phonics to the list of areas of instruction, as well as motivation. The research on these two is quite compelling. And then added the words valid and reliable assessment for the word data, emphasizing the importance of assessment tools that have psychometric properties that lead us to have some confidence in the data, which has not always been the case. So I just find it to be more complete and more active. Again, everyone should have everything I'm saying verbally in the email I sent. The last note in that second paragraph is just, I don't really think reciting personal correspondence in the document, really trying to emphasize scientific information. If you want to place a citation here, there are a number of meta-analyses that we could cite, but I think it becomes potentially polarizing to cite personal information provided by Dr. Corman, or to cite her research and other meta-analyses. Those are my recommendations. no opposition, I'll move on to.
I would certainly invite feedback. I do feel like this particular paragraph is one that has been highly vetted with the group and in fact shared with the department as they were working on their overarching framework, literacy framework and definition, particularly that last sentence. I remember having significant discussion as a task force about the high quality reading instruction includes explicit and systematic phonics instruction. So I certainly would welcome some feedback from the group. If there's any additional feedback on this paragraph, but I do feel like in particular, this was one that was, particularly in our last face-to-face meeting in Chapel Hill, was one that we spent significant time on at the conclusion of our meeting after our opportunity to hear from folks from the state of Mississippi and their work. So just would want to hear from other members of the task force as it relates to this particular paragraph, which I feel like is one of the most heavily vetted that we've discussed.
And this is Karen Sumner. My concern if we deviate from this is we go right back where we were, where things are random in terms of professional development, in terms of what people do. And I just think it's absolutely critical that we are very systematic and strategic about what we're saying this looks like. Otherwise, we're going to be all over the place. And that's sort of, for me, a big reason that this task force exists.
So just to be clear, I have not changed this paragraph except emphasizing the importance of it by adding the word addresses and adding the words valid and reliable assessment data. Phonics was already in the paragraph. The element of instruction that is missing, that is research-based motivation. So I think this is important, and you'll see in my edits throughout the document that I have repeated this series of details so that it does not get lost, so that it gets amplified throughout.
Any objection to the edit around valid and reliable assessment data being added to clarify data? Is there any concern about that adjustment?
This is Kim Winter. No, in fact, I would make a motion if you want us to formally approve changes that we do use the word addresses and add motivation and then valid and reliable assessment prior to data.
Okay. I don't know that we need official motions as long as we're not hearing objection to specific edits. I was trying to help us move through by tackling this a few at a time versus all the edits at once. So is there any concern about the addition of valid and adding valid and reliable assessment data? And I would, hearing no objections, I would suggest that we add that. And Kim, could you clarify the addition of the word motivation?
I was simply reiterating the point that Kristen made a moment ago and agreeing with that, so she might be better to speak to it.
So it's currently in the draft that I sent after the word knowledge and before and comprehension. There is.
The language would be world knowledge, motivation, and comprehension at the end of that sentence. Is there any objection to that language being added?
I'm not sure. It seems like a very different thing we're talking about there, and I agree that it's important. I think we're changing the context of what we've got with that.
What is your reference for that?
In terms of motivation, For me, motivation is also saying supporting different learning styles or
Absolutely.
equity. I mean, I'm not sure that that's a skill per se. It's something that would be embedded in everything.
So I feel differently, and I would point to a number of meta-analyses on this very topic. The effect size of motivation research in the area of reading is actually quite strong. And so I'd point to John Guthrie's work as an example among others. So I do not in any way, shape, or form interpret this as learning styles for which there's no scientific support whatsoever. If you'd like to add the word reading motivation, that would be more specific, but it should be implied.
I wrote a paragraph about motivation and specifically about John Guthrie's work. It's more of a contextual issue he found in his work and others have found. So it's not like a separate domain that you need to master to become a reader. It's really part of the instructional context, so that it's not that you have a reader who is motivated or not. It's that reader is in a context where there are motivational forces at play from the teacher, from the books the teacher gives,
Right.
the skill level, all of that. So it's really something different. You know, it would be like a separate sentence, I guess.
So
I don't know how to fit it into this paragraph in a meaningful way, but it's a very interactive kind of mediation phenomena, whereas in all of the rest of these are initial status and outcomes. They're not mediators of actual instruction. I wrote a paragraph about motivation somewhere. Don't know what happened to it, and specifically reviewed one of Guthrie's studies about this point. So I don't know, maybe a footnote or something about motivation is important and is part of the instructional context for sure. It's just that it's not, it's a mediator. It's very interactive with the particular context of instruction, the student's ability level, the teacher's skill, teaching skill level.
So in studies where teachers have been provided specific strategies to implement, they do find stronger, better, more positive outcomes in reading it. Effect sizes are some of the largest.
Yeah, that's what I mean by a mediator. It's part of the intervention.
Yes.
Just like behavioral interventions are too, they're
That's
mediators. Right. You need to give the teacher strategies for coping with students who are very inattentive, for example, or not motivated. And Guthrie, the good part about his work is he brought science texts, things that were of interest to the students, to bear on instruction to mediate the intervention. Could you put a footnote and add that in? Because it's so separate from these domains that we're mentioning.
Right. So what I would propose is perhaps Barbara and Kristen using the chat to work on a possible additional sentence that could be added for the full task force to consider, so that we can make sure we get feedback on the core part of our document, which is our official recommendations that have the opportunity to change practice and policy in our state. I don't want to minimize our opportunity for discussion here, but perhaps there's an opportunity after we've gone through the recommendations to review a possible addition to this paragraph versus changing what is here beyond what has already been proposed and by affirmation agreed to around being more specific about data. But I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to get to the recommendations. And so with that, I would invite us to move to the recommendations, if that works for the group, with acknowledge that we will come back to this opening couple of paragraphs. But I do want to make sure we are in a position to vote on our specific recommendations. So if we could advance the document to the professional development section, again, acknowledging we will return. And I would invite Crystal at this point to read through the recommendations.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Just want to thank everyone for providing feedback on these recommendations. So just wanted to run through them quickly, and I'll pause after each one and ask Deanna to check the chat box if she will. So the first recommendation is to allocate funding to support ongoing elementary professional development for kindergarten through 5th grade teachers, teacher leaders, literacy coaches, and school leaders. This professional development will address current science of reading utilizing multiple learning approaches, job-embedded coaching, and a variety of technology platforms.
Crystal, this is Kristen. Throughout the document, we refer to leaders in different ways: school leaders, principals, educational leaders. And unless you very specifically mean only school-based leaders, and again, that would need definition, I might propose just using the term educational leaders here and throughout the document.
I think as a part of our charge, we were asked to specifically address principals, and whether we need to say that more specifically, but I do want to make sure we respond to a specific charge from the state board in terms of any additional training, licensure requirements as it relates to principals.
That's a great clarification. And what did you think about educational leaders, comma, especially principals, as clarifier?
I would just say that educational leaders that includes a variety of people. So my assistant superintendent of auxiliary services is an educational leader, and I don't think that is who we are meaning in this. I think that if we leave it as school leaders, teacher leaders, it's very clear. So the readers understand, the state board understands exactly who we're speaking about, because those are the people that are going to impact the most change.
Well, so just to clarify, Crystal, why not just say principals instead, if it's really that specific?
Because then
it would be all administrators, not just principals.
That's right. Because then you leave out assistant principals,
Lead
deans,
teachers.
Lead teachers, teachers that are in advanced teaching roles.
Okay.
Crystal, this is Deanna. In the chat, you have a question from Beth around, is it technology platforms or digital platforms? And then from Gretchen, is the term elementary professional development defined?
Okay, so the first one was about a variety of technology platforms. What was the question about that, Deanna?
Is it technology platforms or digital platforms?
We can use the word digital. I'm fine with that if no one has an objection to that.
I don't think the word elementary is necessary, as it's a polysemous word.
Yeah, we can take that out.
What we really mean is literacy professional development, correct?
That's right.
So that may be the clarification we need.
It's there in the second sentence.
Okay, so just professional development.
Okay.
Might need the word "the" before "current" to be consistent throughout the document. We'll address the current.
I I agree. I almost read it that way.
Okay.
Clarification, Deanna, for these changes that we're making to the document, are those going to be captured in such a way that we can refresh this document prior to our vote?
I know that in the background, Danielle is capturing pieces for the record. If if we can't get everything incorporated prior to the vote, everything is then recorded, etc., for the record, and we'll make sure that all of those are incorporated, much like we do at state board meetings when we have changes, and then that will be what is captured as the vote of approval by this body, everything that you are agreeing to as changes, and we'll make sure that we send out the final draft, the final copy before it's sent to the state board, just as a matter of order and review.
All right, Crystal, you want to continue?
Yes. So recommendation 2, allocate literacy coaches to every elementary school with at least one coach dedicated to grades K2 and one coach dedicated to grades 3-5. Okay. I'll move on. I don't see anything there. Recommendation 3, develop an early literacy micro-credential requiring at least 60 contact hours that requires candidates to demonstrate proficiency in the 6 components of the reading process: comprehension, oral language, phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary.
So this is Kristen, and I have a suggestion. Well, actually, I have a couple of comments and a suggestion, but I would recommend not specifying the 6 elements. We've been debating this now months. I would either use the list that's in that opening paragraph, and again, that reiterates it and makes it powerful. I think that's one option. The other would be to use the language, again, that's used throughout the document, and that would be the current science of reading. So proficiency in the current science of reading, or proficiency in, and then it would be, go back to the beginning, the current science of reading that addresses the acquisition of language, phonological awareness, that whole.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, that if we lift that same list from the executive summary, lift that exact language and put that there, does everybody think that would be a good idea? That way it's consistent.
And Crystal, Joy was saying that she agrees with, she prefers the change Kristen made about the current science of reading for this recommendation, but you get an agreement from others in the chat as well.
Okay. So I think we will replace that with the list from the executive summary, just for clarity. I think that just makes it easier. And as I was reading it, I also said the word required and requires twice.
Yeah.
Develop an early literacy. I don't know if anybody has any suggestion about that. We have the word requiring in the parentheses and then requires candidates. Maybe we take out requiring, yes, in the parentheses.
Yes.
Crystal, may I offer another observation I don't really have an opinion of? But I do want to draw people's attention to the 60 hours. I don't know where it came from specifically, but 60 hours is about a third of a graduate course. A single graduate course is about 150 hours of content, 45 hours face-to-face, and then another roughly 90 outside of class. So I'm just mentioning that. And you probably talked about the 60 hours. It's not a really robust amount of professional development. about one graduate credit.
I'll let other members who are on this committee jump in, but I believe that the number 4 would, and we may need to change that order now that I'm thinking about it, that perhaps number 4 is what is required for teacher. That's like everyone, but if you wanted to do additional and wanted to earn that micro-credential, it would be 60. So I know that we talked a lot in our committee about that number 60, Kristen.
Okay. I think your point about switching 3 and 4 makes a whole lot more sense, because then it is cumulative. We're talking about 90 hours, really.
Yeah, so number 4 would be just to renew your license, and then number 3 would be if you want to go above and beyond and earn that micro-credential.
That's great.
Do you think that would help, Kristen, in the
Absolutely.
readability? Okay, we'll switch those.
Definitely.
Okay, we'll switch those two. So then I'll jump to number 4, which will now be number 3. Require 30 contact hours of literacy professional development based on the current science of reading for elementary teacher licensure renewal.
And this, as a reminder, is based on my conversation with Tom Tomberlin that there's already a requirement of 30 contact hours in literacy, so just making sure we have consistency of our expectation.
One question, and I think we talked about it last time. Our folks in early childhood are teaching in our public schools in early reading. And I think we talked about adding early childhood here, and we also talked about special educators who would certainly, if we're really trying to make an impact here in terms of early reading, our early childhood professionals, elementary teachers, and special educators are the ones who have the greatest impact in early literacy. I'd like to see all 3 listed. I know it goes a little beyond the charge, but we've done it in other places.
So, Kristen, one of the things I learned in my conversation with Tom Tomberlin is anyone who has a K-12 license, which would be art, music, foreign language, social workers, counselors, anybody that has that K-12 licensure would have to meet this elementary teacher licensure renewal requirement. So that allows us to essentially scoop up anybody who's going to work in an elementary school would have to meet this requirement. And since we also have pre-K in nonprofits and in community-based programs, and again, given our charge and the fact that the Department of Public Instruction does not have programmatic oversight for pre-K, it falls under another division. That's the reason for this language. So
this is
so in other words, special education teachers, English language learner teachers who have K-12 license would fall under this requirement.
and is that the same for the recommendation? I guess now is 4, but where you said develop an early literacy micro-credential that requires candidates. I was wondering who the candidates were. Are we requiring all teachers to do this?
So this would be for anyone who wanted that literacy micro-credential. So it would be anybody who wanted that.
For anyone who wants it.
Yeah,
Okay.
so if you're a candidate for that micro-credential, that's what you would have to do.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just wasn't clear in that sentence, I guess, to me. That requires candidates to demonstrate.
Okay. I'll work on that and send something to Danielle to hopefully clarify that, to move us along. I think Tom wanted to say something.
Yes, just a point of clarity on a couple of things with this. So the K-12 licenses, technically what happens with those licenses is the PD requirement is based on their assignment at the time of renewal. So if you had an art teacher teaching in an elementary setting they would be required to earn the 3 CEUs in literacy. But if that art teacher was teaching at the high school, that requirement would not hold. So I just wanted to clarify that. I don't want to get it out that we're going to require all K-12 teachers to do the literacy requirements, because I think unless you want to make that recommendation to change that, how we operationalize that in licensure would be the requirement is applied based on the assignment. So all your elementary school social workers and folks like that would be held to the literacy requirement, but they would not be at the secondary level.
That is our intent. Thank you for that clarification.
And one thing about the micro-credential here, just to make everybody clear about the way I would understand this works, this is not in any way connected to the licensure, but certainly a person could use the credits earned during a micro-credential as their CEUs. That's not a problem. The way I would think about this, just reacting to what I'm listening to, is that this could be some kind of employment requirement from a local board of education. So in order to hold a certain position, we would require the candidate to hold the micro-credential, but it's not actually a licensure issue. It's more of an employment job qualification issue. Now, that's the way I'm interpreting it when I think about it. So I just wanted to make sure that was in line with how you folks would view this micro-credential.
I think the way that I was reading this particular one and the way that I understood it was that the candidates aren't necessarily people who are applying for jobs, but they're candidates of the micro-credentialing. So not necessarily someone who's applying for a position. I guess that we could go that route with this, but I was thinking in the way that it's phrased, it sounds like the candidate is someone who's saying that I want this extra credential or this extra step placed on my license, but not necessarily, the candidate wouldn't necessarily be someone who's applying for a particular job, like a coach or whatever the case is. But I do understand that if we wanted to do that in conjunction with like recommendation 2, that local LEAs could have that autonomy to do that.
What if for number 3, we just said develop and offer an early literacy micro-credential? I think that word offer might make it clear that it's not a requirement.
Right.
Develop and offer an early literacy micro-credential, at least 60 contact hours that requires candidates to demonstrate proficiency in, and then we would use the list.
I like that.
I think we've got agreement on that, Crystal.
Okay, all right. I think we did, I don't think we did 5. Require 5 contact hours for literacy professional development based on the current science of reading for principal licensure. And then 6, establish advanced degree pay compensation for K-5 literacy coaches trained in the current science of reading.
I was hoping that we would be more inclusive in this recommendation and include K-5 educators more broadly. It is really, really important for our classroom teachers, not just our coaches, to receive, to earn their master's in reading and then receive a compensation. If we only compensate the coaches, we could have a very unintended consequence of a really skilled reading teacher leaving the classroom to get a raise as a coach.
Kristen, we addressed that in recommendation 3 in pre-service preparation and licensure.
Okay, so that redundancy was intentional?
We can review it when we get to that and make a decision if we want to adjust. But if we could try to get through the document and see, since your concern is addressed later, but it may be that it needs to be moved to this section. But let's get through the entire document and see where the group feels we need to make any adjustments in order or other things. All right. right, Beth, do you want to take us through curriculum and instructional resources, please?
Sure. And as we get started on this one, I was thinking about our state board presentation and was thinking if curriculum and instruction came after the pre-service, then part of the narrative could be as our teachers leave pre-service preparation and move into the classroom, what are the curriculum and instructional resources they, as well as other teachers, need to then be able to successfully provide instruction aligned to the current science of reading. And so looking at these, which I would suggest that after we go through these, we would change the order, and that the order of these, maybe we start with saying a teacher into the classroom would first need, we would first need the, sorry, let me see, the number two would become number one. So the create guidance and resources to support the understanding of the current science of reading, i.e. definition, model, framework, communication documents, printables for parents, etc. And I did look at Kristen's recommended changes that cleaned that up. If everyone wants to look at that for a moment. Was fine with those recommended changes, which changes just within the parentheses, e.g. definition, model, framework, resources for teachers and parents. Everyone okay with that? Someone, Joy, I think that's a great recommendation to replace parents with families. I think that's a great recommendation.
All right, Beth, you want to continue?
All right, the second thing that a teacher needs is when, after they've come out of preparation programs, is they need to have quality resources in their classroom. Therefore, the former recommendation number 1 would be recommendation number 2. And that recommendation was to define criteria for evidence-based resources aligned to the current science of reading, create a state-level rubric utilizing expert literacy stakeholders, teachers, school leaders, district leaders, DPI representatives, institutes of higher ed partners, etc., to review, vet, and determine alignment of K-5 literacy core, supplemental, and intensive materials aligned to the current science of reading. And then also looked at the recommended changes that Kristen proposed in cleaning this up. And here is a question I have for everyone to please think through. I believe that the intent of our committee when we worked on this was to lift the burden off LEAs or districts and charters, public school units, to make identification of high quality instructional materials aligned to the current science of reading easy to select or easy to identify. And I don't believe that we've ended up with a recommendation that necessarily does that. I don't think we ever meant that there would be a list and you have to pick off of a list, but what we were trying to do is take the heavy lifting off of the districts and somehow allow the LEAs, all 115 LEAs, not to have to go through the same process of evaluating all the resources.
And Beth, I think that does reflect, for folks that were not in both of our small group opportunities, some concern particularly about small districts with a limited central office capacity as well as challenges at the building level in terms of that was a reason for this as well. Not to take away the final decision-making process from schools, but to provide support, thinking about the capacity and the difference in school districts from our smallest to our largest in the state. So I do think that reflects discussion, both of your committee and discussion that came out of both of our smaller group feedback opportunities.
So where we have ended is with creating a rubric, and I think there are rubrics already out there available and tools already available for us to use. So I'm not sure that our committee would recommend doing the work of creating an additional rubric, but something that would help the districts not have to do all of this heavy lifting themselves of selecting or finding which resources qualify to be called aligned to the science of reading.
Beth, this is Kristen, and my caution with lists that are vetted by groups is that they become very time-stamped, and they can lead to textbook adoption, which will limit choices. It becomes a very bureaucratic process. Would you be willing to consider the revision I suggested that focuses on creating this rubric that's unique to North Carolina, followed by a sentence that says something about EPI making evaluation data available to LEAs, such that it really satisfies both opportunities. One, for people to use the tool themselves, and then two, DPI creates a clearinghouse of these evaluations such that if they can't evaluate themselves, they can at least see what others have done.
One thing that we lose in that is that we are suggesting here that it's not just the literacy core, which would be the adopted materials, but it's also the supplemental and the intensive materials that would fall underneath this.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I wouldn't change. So those are all listed in the revision I suggested. I would just add a sentence about DPI creating a clearinghouse of the evaluations of all three of those. So the core reading, the supplemental, and the
So if we can come back to that one, because if we move, so remember the narrative we're saying, as a teacher, you come in, you've got these guidance and frameworks and models that standardize across the state about the science, the current science of reading. And now we want to make sure that every classroom, teacher, and student has evidence-based instructional resources aligned to the science of reading. And then the third recommendation is to allocate funding for evidence-based core, supplemental, and intensive intervention instructional materials aligned to the current science of reading for every K-5 student. And that has been, that's the one that's been amended and cleaned up by Kristen. Kristen, just for clarification on that last sentence where it says intensive intervention and instructional materials, the and in there.
you could put a comma after intervention and it becomes clearer, I think.
Okay.
And I only added the word intervention because the term intensive could mean different things to other people. And I think you were talking about intervention materials. So I hope that just clarified. It's not intended to change anything.
So does anyone have any other changes to that recommendation?
I just have a question. This is Christy Day. When we talk about funding, are we talking about additional funding?
So the discussion along this, as we've worked through this and had these meetings online virtually, has been that the word allocation is used very purposefully because there are funds already allocated to maybe strategies that haven't been effective. And so it would really be up to the state board of how they might reallocate those funds. And is that correct?
That's correct. We're not necessarily requesting additional funding, but just the notion that any funding would have to be evidence-based core, everything else that you just read. So this would be a significant change.
Beth, you have a comment from Vicky in the chat about concerns about using only in number 3. She references the previous document from May 19. Didn't read that way, so that's a concern to lift up here.
I think the word only was eliminated in the version that just read.
It was eliminated in the first version. My understanding is the reason only was put in there, a prior version, was also a way to say that the funding would only be given to LEAs or PS public school units that were adopting evidence-based materials. So if the districts were adopting something else, it wouldn't be funded.
So Vicky, are you wanting to keep the word only in or take it out? I'm a bit unclear. So I think what we're contemplating here is that if state funding is involved, that state funding would only be used for evidence-based core supplemental and intensive instructional materials, which
I'm like Christy. When Christy made the comment just a minute ago about are we talking about additional funding? I think if we're saying additional funding will be made available just for those purposes, that's one thing. But I have a problem with the word only there because it sounds like we're excluding. And this was something that we talked about in our subcommittee work when we were in the small room there at DPI. I just don't like the word only there. I get what we're going for is that we want the LEAs to choose wisely and to choose the materials that support this new paradigm shift, but I just don't like the word only. In the document from the 19th, only was not in there, and I liked the wording of that one. I pulled that one up. So like Christy, I think if we say additional funding would be provided for this, that sounds positive, where when you say the funding, if you say only this, it just sounds like I don't know.
I know that as just a school level principal speaking, that I think that one of the reasons that I know that we have our, the mission that the state board has given us, but I also think that a part of the reason that we're in this space, that we're even needing a literacy task force, is that I think that, there are 2 ditches on either side of a road. And I think what has happened is that not just in North Carolina, but across our country, so there is certainly the need for autonomy, and there's the need for flexibility in schools and LEAs and school districts, and just looking at the different dynamics and different demographics and tax bases as far as like funding and all of that. I do understand that. But I also think that keeping the word only gives teeth and credence to recommendation 1. I think that if our leading recommendation for curriculum and instruction says define criteria for evidence-based resources, then we definitely, just from a principal's perspective and just thinking about, how school districts need to move forward and really having some teeth around supporting the work that the task force and the recommendations, I think that we're definitely going to have some more direct language. And I think that the word only certainly provides that and provides that teeth that we're going to need to empower these recommendations moving forward. So I get that we want to, make sure that people have, feel flexibility and autonomy, but certainly as a school principal, having worked in different dynamics, I definitely think we need to move forward with the word only to be able to provide teeth and support for school districts and at the state level for enforcing, what we know to be best practice and the recommendations that we're putting our names behind.
And so to add to what Kim said, if we take the word only out, we're saying that it will be okay when there's a literacy textbook adoption for districts to use state funds to purchase a textbook or a curriculum that is not evidence-based. So I just want to make sure we understand the intent here is around state funding, and that if we take the word only out, we are opening up the opportunity for districts to use state dollars to invest in curriculum, core curriculum, that is not aligned to the current science of reading. So just want to make sure that we have our eyes wide open, and would personally, I certainly agree with Kim that our purpose is to have 100% of our districts using core, supplemental, and intervention materials that are aligned.
So another thought would be that if we had the wording allocate funding for evidence-based, core, supplemental, and intensive intervention instructional materials aligned to the current science of reading for every K-5 student, that too is saying that that's the only thing that funding can be used for, right? So if we're allocating funding for evidence-based core, okay, so I'm sorry. So it sounds like, and I'm looking at a lot of the chat. So it sounds like there is support for the word only, or wording that says the funding can only be used on evidence-based instructional materials. Is that what I hear the group agreeing to? Okay.
Let's move on so we make sure we get to all our
recommendations. And recommendation number 4. And you guys, I had used Kristen's version, so I'm going to read from that. Allocate funding for high-quality professional development and job-embedded coaching so all educators can receive consistent feedback related to instruction in the current science of reading. I thought that language cleaned it up.
It worked.
Okay. And again, if you go back to the narrative I was talking about, we've talked about funding materials, evidence-based materials, and then providing high-quality professional development and that job-embedded coaching and feedback. And then our next recommendation would be number 5. And again, reading from the cleanup that Kristen did, I would say, in order to support the highest quality reading instruction, develop an implementation rubric for instruction aligned to the current science of reading. This tool could be used by educators, school leaders, and these we've got to make, whatever we make in the document, we've got to make these consistent. But this tool could be used by educators, educational leaders, and coaches to assess and reflect on the implementation of instructional practices and strategies aligned with the current science of reading. So I like the way Kristen cleaned that up. I just would want to make sure that whatever we've decided to use of teachers, principals, or whatever, that we're consistent in that one. Okay, anybody have any concerns? All right, so now the recommendation 6, identify, fund, and implement a valid and reliable universal literacy screener for K-5 and align it with NC check-ins, EOGs, NCDPI resource banks, assessment items, etc. Okay, after reading this again last night and this morning, I'm wondering if this recommendation is needed. And I was wondering if it really communicates what we had tried to get at in the first place, which is, you know, if we're going to give teachers professional development on the science aligned to the current science of reading and high quality materials aligned, but then our assessments don't align with that, or certain professional development offerings don't align with that, etc., then we're kind of sending teachers a mixed message. So that was the premise of that, but I don't know if it's really even needed. What are your thoughts?
Beth, I think it's absolutely needed. And the nonsense that we've seen around literacy assessment in North Carolina the last 12 months speaks to why this is necessary. I'm rereading it this morning with fresh eyes, and I think if we're choosing valid and reliable assessments, so this is a literacy screener that would help us identify who is at most risk for reading difficulties or may already be experiencing them. I think it's essential. I'd love to see it pre-K-5. And then the second part of the sentence, which I actually made the revision and I'm going to revise it again, and align it with. No, actually the alignment needs to be and NC check-ins, EOGs, NCDPI resource banks, et cetera, need to be aligned to the valid and reliable assessment, not the other way around. But I do think this is a missing piece, and what we know about school change is that what is assessed is taught. The assessment is really, really critical, and I'd go so far as to say we also need to be looking at developing a bank of resources related to diagnostic assessments. So the students who are identified at risk for reading difficulties or experiencing them, they need a second tier of diagnostic assessment to really inform instruction. And I think that's what recommendation number 7 is intended to be as well.
There seems to be, Beth, a lot of agreement that we should keep this recommendation. I do think one thing we could do is eliminate the reference to teacher professional learning, because we've already addressed that in the first set of recommendations, so that we keep this particular recommendation focused specifically on screeners, check-ins, assessment items, rather than throwing teacher professional learning back in there, if the group would agree with that.
Okay, and may I propose that what we want is a valid and reliable literacy screener that is aligned to the current science of reading, as well as assess the check-ins, EOGs, and other items that are also aligned to the current science of reading.
If it's valid and reliable, it's aligned to the current science of reading. I just want to make sure that all those resources DPI puts in place are aligned to the assessment and not the other way around.
Okay, so I'll just need to work on the wording of that, and while we're on the next section, maybe.
Okay, if you could send that to Danielle.
Okay. All right, and the last recommendation, again, reading from Kristen's version, identify, fund, and implement valid and reliable diagnostic assessments that address the current science of reading, including the acquisition of language syntax, semantics, morphology, and pragmatics, phonological and phonemic awareness, accurate and efficient word identification, phonics and spelling, world knowledge, motivation, and comprehension. I know motivation is going to be a word we're going to talk about more. These assessments are to be used to determine instructional priorities for students identified as being in need of intervention by the universal screener.
This is Kim. I would just make one point that I guess in support of something like this revision from Kristen, because in the original, we specifically talk about 4th and 5th grade and being a middle school person and teaching particularly 6th and 7th graders. So many of them have this need. And if there is a universal screener adopted, that would be something as a language arts teacher that I could employ to help identify needs of students. And if you take out those specific grade levels and have a more comprehensive statement, this would allow teachers at other levels to implement.
I think we've had strong agreement all through the way about a worry about students beyond grade 3, and you saw in the charge that we had that they realized that we might expand our recommendation in certain places. So I think potentially just given other feedback about even high school students and middle school students, that the revision of this creates that opportunity that you just articulated, Kim.
So not to belabor the point, but would we want universal screeners to to go to grades beyond K-5 instead of diagnostics?
Pretty hard to name one. I'm going through my mental Rolodex of the tools that are out there. This is really about learning to read. I think I mean, you could use an instrument like the Gates and Kennedy in grades 5 and beyond to identify kids who are in the bottom quartile or decile. It's not really a screener. It's not designed to be a screener. Barbara, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I have a conflict of interest there, but Lexia has a screener that goes up above 3rd grade all the way to 10th grade. So, and there may be others. You know, it's useful for kids who are really struggling in order to place them in the right kind of intervention. But I'm reminded that this task force is focused on K-3. Mm-hmm. Is that not correct?
Yes.
So I don't know that we should stray beyond that.
Yeah.
I'd also worry about I mean, the vast majority of students are not in need of diagnostic assessment, so roughly, maybe 10 to 30%, depending on community, might need diagnostic assessment, and why we would put all kids at the upper grade levels through a screener, it just feels like too much testing. And I'd be fine if you wanted to change the screener to 3. I think that's most appropriate.
All right, I want to make sure we have time to get to pre-service preparation and licensure. And I know that Melba may be at a place where she's going to have to leave shortly, but I do want to at least create an opportunity for us to look at these recommendations. Melba,
So, and closing out this section, I would just like to maybe put forth to the group for recommendation number 7. In our original recommendation, it did say to also provide diagnostics for grades 4 and 5. And the thinking behind that was, we know, because we have the tools in K-3, when students are coming out of grade 3 behind. And so the diagnostics would give us more information about what specific interventions the students needed in 4th and 5th grade. So would say that those diagnostics, we would ask for those to be funded for 4th and 5th grade.
right, are we ready to move to pre-service preparation and licensure? And we have had a recommendation that as we get to our final document, that we put pre-service preparation and licensure recommendations first, followed by, as best suggested, the curriculum and instructional resources, and concluding with the professional development. So with that sequence in mind, we can start with these recommendations. I don't know if Melba is still on and could at least start us off, and then some of us that were on the pre-service preparation and licensure could take over. I think you can see it on your screens. I don't know that there's a need to read it as much as just provide any feedback.
And this is Melba. I am still on, but I do have to leave in about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So it'd probably be best if I actually did not start, except to say that, you know, like you said, they're on the screen. I don't know if we need to go through them verbatim. I'm kind of going back and forth between Kristen's feedback and then the ones that are here. Certainly, I think we need to give these really a lot of, you know, time in terms of the intensity, but so let me just start, and then I will turn over the mic when I have to leave. I wouldn't leave, but I have my lab school meeting with my Winston-Salem partners, so I have to do that.
Okay.
So first recommendation is around setting clear expectations that early childhood, elementary, special ed, and leader preparation programs ensure their candidates deeply understand and organize their teaching around the principles and practices identified in the standards for the preparation of literacy professions. And you can see the citation there. Any comments?
We do need to delete the phrase "see full document for supporting recommendations," because we have the supporting recommendations below. Just a quick note.
And I believe that is out of Kristen's recent version, right? Okay.
I also just noticed a typo. That's literacy professionals, not profession.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, and then the supporting recommendations, approve common standards. I had a question around the common. Are we speaking common in terms of, and I think certainly I want us to make sure that we're clear on this, common standards across EPPs, common standards within an EPP? That was a question I had that was given to me. So approve common standards and expectations for preparation in literacy that reflect principles and practices identified within the current science of reading. EPPs should be required to align program requirements, including coursework and clinical experiences, to the standards identified within these common expectations. Because we use that word common a lot.
I actually eliminated this and included it in recommendation 2. Because I felt recommendation 1 already outlined what the standards were. And I found it confusing, and I offered that as a member of this committee. So I think A and B are not necessary, and C I turned into a recommendation on it.
Kristen, I agree. I think that looks really good to have it listed as recommendation 2 with the supporting bullets underneath.
Yeah, without the additional ABs, yeah.
Okay, and that was Kim, who was also on the committee, right? The subcommittee?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So we're going with.
I didn't want to confuse all these different standards. I think we were pretty clear about which standards. And anyway, food for thought.
Okay. So we're still under, so we took out the recommendation, those areas under recommendation 1. Let me give the mic over. Kristen or Kim, can you take that and run with it? I'm going to have to scoot now.
Sure, absolutely. Kristen, why don't you read out recommendation 2 as you put it with the supporting bullets underneath?
Sure. I don't know if Deanna can pull it up. It'd be probably a whole lot faster if we could look at that. But recommendation 2 reads, require all educator preparation programs to engage candidates in intentionally sequenced clinical experiences that include opportunities to, and then there are 3 bullet points, observe literacy teaching practices, for example, faculty, university supervisors, mentors, that reflect the principles and practices of current science of reading. Bullet point 2, engage in early, deliberate, and sustained practice opportunities during which candidates enact the principles and practices associated with the current science of reading. For example, low stakes practice with teacher, educators, and peers, semicolon, authentic practice opportunities with children in early and elementary settings. Bullet point 3, receive substantive and actionable feedback on enacted teaching practices using an observation instrument focused on the principles and practices identified within the current science of reading, especially as it relates to the teaching of reading.
So this is again, and I would just say this suggested change allows the document to be consistent throughout, and in my view, does not change the intent of what we were proposing as a committee.
And I would just add to what Kim said, and I agree that this reflects recommendations that came out of the literacy community of practice through the UNC General Administration, EPP, Teacher Advisory Group. And I was waiting to hear Kim's response to this because she has served on all 3 of these groups. And I would agree that it does capture and make it exceedingly consistent and tight.
Recommendation 3, I think I might have put in the comments that this may go better in the PD section. I'm not totally sure. The PD section will, remember, follow this later in the document when we have the final document, so it probably goes best there. This is all related to teacher, incenting teachers. And so recommendation 3 reads, provide opportunities and incentives for teacher educators, including clinical faculty and mentors, to engage in professional learning opportunities to enhance their ability to support candidates' enactment of the principles and practices identified in the standards for the preparation of literacy professionals and the current science of reading. That's the main recommendation. Related recommendations include, read those bullets, or I don't know if they're being presented somewhere. Related recommendations include convening a team of literacy experts to identify or develop online self-paced and face-to-face training modules. Bullet point 2, successful completion of the training modules and common online assessment should be accepted by the state as evidence that program completers possess the identified knowledge and skills. This could actually feed very nicely into that micro-credentialing that was part of the PD group. And then the next bullet is individuals who achieve the credential should be allowed to facilitate future state-supported professional learning for other teacher educators and receive appropriate compensation. Looking at this now, I'd say other teacher educators teach, I don't know, this is not just higher ed. But yeah, I mean, it's fine. We want to leave it that way.
I would just, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, Kim.
Well, I just was going to say that I think, again, this allows us to keep the spirit of, or our intent from the previous groups, but also allow this document to be consistent throughout. And then also, I love the idea of putting it in professional development because it again shows that we're all doing this together. As EPPs in higher ed, it's often a side, separate category kind of thing. And from my perspective, that doesn't make sense. We're all a community together. And so I do like and support the idea of putting it with professional development.
And just for purposes of the committee, we're at a place where I think we're going to need to refresh this document before we can expect people to vote. So we're going to need to be identifying an opportunity simply for a vote, separate from this meeting, but allowing time for people to digest not only the changes that have been made, but also looking at the document holistically. So just want to set the stage so that people can use our remaining time to provide that feedback, but with the understanding that we will have a very abbreviated focus meeting to vote. There will be not additional opportunity for feedback other than capturing your feedback on the draft document. And it's going to be imperative that folks take the time to look at that document and ask questions and provide feedback. We have the benefit of all the comments that have been shared in the chat, and we'll make sure to incorporate those, but just want to set the stage that we are not at a place to vote on this document, in my opinion, based on the great discussion that we've had, substantive one, but I do believe, I personally, and I know others that have indicated so, need a time to review a refreshed document. So we'll be working with Diana and Crystal to find that time that we can get folks back on for potentially a very abbreviated meeting. I will explore with Deanna whether that vote can be electronic, but I would feel better about us gathering for 15 minutes just to come together as a group and celebrate getting to a milestone for our kids. So we want to use any remaining time we have for feedback. I do want to surface one thing in the pre-service area that I may have missed in Kristen's revised reading, but again want to remind you that we were specifically asked to address educational leadership programs and any, as well as the professional learning for principals, assistant principals, and other principal certified leaders in a building. And so I want to make sure we don't lose that because it was an ask. And in the Google Doc, I had asked for feedback from this group about the use of the word substantive. We have been reluctant to put a number there or a number of contact hours. Certainly am open to some feedback from the group, but I do want to make sure we do not lose that recommendation since it was a specific ask in our charge.
And that is very clearly in recommendation number 7.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's not lose it.
Okay, great. Any final feedback? We are approaching the 11 o'clock hour.
And a few chats back, I believe Tom had asked to make a comment or a question.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more of a comment on the EPP section, the preparation section at large. So I think it would be helpful for this group to understand how we approve those programs at DPI. So EPPs submit their blueprints, the courses they will offer, and assurances that they're meeting those requirements. But we don't monitor the actual content that is delivered, and so I think that becomes a very important thing in how you approach this. Who's assuring that the science of reading concepts and get implemented in those courses? Because I think there's an assumption here that DPI will somehow monitor that, and the only way we monitor that is nominally. If it says it's there, we assume it's there, and there's no. Is that the purview of the institutions in which the EPPs are housed, or who's assuring? Who's the subject matter expert that's ensuring that those things are aligned?
So you could require, Tom, and maybe you already do, but you could require a curriculum map that shows those standards and which courses in the preparation programs those standards are addressed.
That's a point well made. This is Kim. I would just say that when we sign off on those assurances, having been a director of teacher ed and licensure officer for a long time, we take very seriously legislative pieces. And there are other things that come into play, legislation that is relevant to content in other programs. And so typically what happens in EPP is there are documents, curricular documents, as Kristen mentioned, a curriculum map, other kinds of things that we use to review as curriculum bodies prior to clicking on those assurances, and then also have conversations on our ends, and frankly use that information when we write our narratives for our annual IHE reports that are turned in not only for undergraduate and graduate teacher ed, but also MSA programs separately, which are principal training programs. And so I certainly hear the point about who's looking at that, but I do believe that EPPs take that responsibility quite seriously.
And I would agree with it wholeheartedly. I just wanted this group to be clear that that is in large part, a self-monitoring process for the EPPs. That we on the EPP group don't have the staff in all subject areas to make sure that those alignments are occurring the way, exactly how they should be. We're just looking to say that did they say they met all those things, and which is fine. I'm not suggesting that we need some kind of literacy police on this, but I just wanted this group to know that.
To be generous with your acceptance of a time that will not work 100% for everyone, and it may require all of us or some of us to miss 15 minutes of another meeting or come in to that meeting late. And I would just ask that it is incredibly important to Crystal and myself that we have as close to 100% participation in our vote meeting. And so just would ahead of time ask for you to, if at all possible, make it work in your calendar. And I will explore if there are other options that we have available beyond reconvening. But time does not allow that today. I want to thank everyone for both your participation with voice as well as asking questions in the chat. And certainly to Kristen and others that have provided good feedback that will get us to a better set of recommendations. We are scheduled to share these recommendations with the state board at their June 3rd meeting. We'll be providing additional information so as many of the task force members can join the live streaming of that and be fully engaged and a part of that presentation. So with that, Deanna, unless there are any closing comments from you, I would accept a motion for adjournment and a second.
I move to adjourn.
A second?
A second.
All right. All those in favor indicate by aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deanna, are you still on?
I am. Let me get everything stopped and get streaming stopped, and then I'll be right with you.
And this is Gretchen. Did you say when the voting meeting will be?
We're going to get that turned around as quickly as possible. Gretchen, we have to notice the meeting, so we just need to quickly regroup with the DPI team and determine how quickly we can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're gonna stop it now. Oh, he was telling,